The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1882, and Benjamin Garrett knew before he opened it that his brother was dead. He stood in the dusty street of Georgetown, Colorado, reading the words that confirmed what his gut had already told him. Pneumonia had taken Samuel in less than a week, leaving behind a ranch in Montana and debts Benjamin would now inherit. The paper trembled in his hands, not from grief but from the sudden weight of responsibility settling on shoulders that had grown too comfortable with solitude. Benjamin left Georgetown within 3 days, selling what little he owned and packing the rest into 2 worn saddlebags. The mining town had been his home for 5 years, a place where he could disappear into the mountains and forget that he'd once had dreams bigger than a pickaxe, and a claim that never quite paid out. At 32, he'd grown accustomed to cooking beans for one, to conversations with his horse, to the particular silence that came with being entirely alone. The ride north took him through Wyoming's rolling plains and into Montana's vast grasslands, where the sky stretched so wide, it made a man feel both infinite and insignificant at once. The ranch Samuel had left behind sat in a valley outside Billings, a modest spread with 100 acres of grazing land and a cabin that needed more work than Benjamin had energy to give. He arrived on a cold October evening, the first frost already threatening the dying grass. Inside, he found his brother's life preserved like a museum. Dishes still in the sink, a half-read book on the table, boots by the door waiting for feet that would never fill them again. Benjamin spent that first night on the porch, unable to sleep in a dead man's bed, watching stars wheel overhead and wondering what the hell he was supposed to do with a cattle ranch when he knew more about gold veins than livestock. The neighboring ranchers came calling within the week, curious about Samuel's brother and whether he'd stay or sell. They were weathered men with wives who brought casseroles and pies, their kindness genuine but their eyes assessing. Could this newcomer handle the work? Did he have the spine for Montana winters? Benjamin thanked them and ate their food and gave answers that committed him to nothing. At night he cooked simple meals, coffee, beans, cornbread when he had the energy. Always for one. Always too much or too little, never quite right. Samuel's debts proved substantial. The bank in Billings held a note for $300, due in 6 months. There were outstanding bills at the general store, money owed to the blacksmith, a promise made to purchase breeding stock that Samuel had never fulfilled. Benjamin went through the account books with growing dread, realizing his brother had been barely scraping by, one bad season away from losing everything. The responsible thing would be to sell, take whatever remained after the debts were settled, and return to Colorado. But something kept Benjamin there through October and into November. Perhaps pride, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps just the fear of returning to that mine shaft and admitting that both Garrett brothers had failed at their respective dreams. He learned cattle work through trial and error, making mistakes that would have been funny if they weren't so costly. He lost 3 head in a ravine because he didn't know the land well enough. He paid too much for hay because he didn't know the going rate. He fixed fence posts in the wrong season and had to redo them when they wouldn't set properly. The work was endless and exhausting, and every night he came home to that empty cabin and cooked meals that tasted like failure. Beans and bacon, potatoes fried in lard, biscuits that came out either hard as rocks or undercooked in the middle. He ate mechanically, fuel for a body that ached in new places every morning. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, snow lay thick on the ground, and the temperature dropped low enough that Benjamin had to break ice on the water troughs twice daily. He'd managed to hire a ranch hand, An older Mexican man named Carlos who knew cattle and didn't talk much, which suited Benjamin fine. Together they worked in companionable silence, moving the herd to winter pasture, reinforcing the barn, laying in supplies for the hard months ahead. Carlos had a family in town and left each evening, riding back to warmth and noise and life. Benjamin envied him that, though he'd never say so aloud. The stagecoach accident happened on a Thursday in late November, during a snowstorm that had rolled in fast and furious from the north. Benjamin heard about it from Carlos, who'd heard it in town. The stage had overturned 15 miles south, pushed off the road by wind and poor visibility. The driver was dead, his neck broken in the crash. Of the 4 passengers, 2 had been injured and taken to the doctor in Billings. One had continued on to his destination despite a badly bruised shoulder. And one, a young woman traveling alone, had nowhere to go because her trunks had been destroyed in the accident, and the boarding house she'd arranged to stay at had burned down the week prior. Benjamin listened to this story while shoeing a horse, not particularly interested until Carlos added, "Mrs. Henderson at the general store is looking for someone to take her in for a few days. The girl needs time to sort out her situation, maybe earn some money to replace what she lost." "Not my concern," Benjamin said, driving a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. "She is cooking for the Hendersons in exchange for sleeping in their storage room," Carlos continued, his tone carefully neutral. "Mrs. Henderson says she is very good. Made a beef roast that had half the town stopping by to see what smelled so fine." Benjamin straightened, his back protesting. He looked at Carlos, who was studying the horizon with unusual intensity. "Why are you telling me this?" "No reason, boss. Just talk." But there was the hint of something in Carlos's voice, perhaps concern, perhaps pity. "You are too thin. A man needs proper food to work hard." It was manipulation, obvious and transparent, but it lodged in Benjamin's brain like a burr. That night, eating burned beans scraped from the bottom of a pot, he thought about beef roast and the smell of good cooking. He thought about the empty cabin, and the way silence had become so normal he barely noticed it anymore. He thought about Samuel, who had died alone, and whether that would be his fate too. When he rode into Billings the next morning, he told himself it was to pick up supplies. The fact that he stopped at Henderson's general store first was purely coincidental. Grace Porter stood behind the counter, helping Mrs. Henderson organize shelves of canned goods. Benjamin knew who she was immediately, though they'd never met. She had dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her dress, though clean and well-mended, showed signs of hard wear. She was perhaps 25, with the kind of face that wouldn't stop traffic but grew prettier the longer you looked at it. What caught Benjamin's attention were her hands. They moved with quick efficiency, never wasting motion, the hands of someone accustomed to work. "Mr. Garrett," Mrs. Henderson said, her face lighting up with the expression of a woman who sees opportunity walking through her door. "What a pleasant surprise. I do not believe you have met Miss Porter. Grace, this is Benjamin Garrett, Samuel's brother. He has taken over the ranch outside town." Grace turned, and Benjamin found himself looking into eyes the color of storm clouds. She nodded politely. "Mr. Garrett, I am sorry for your loss. The Hendersons spoke highly of your brother." Her voice was educated, Eastern, out of place in this rough Montana town. Benjamin fumbled with his hat, suddenly aware that he probably smelled like horses and looked like he'd been sleeping in his clothes, which he had. "Thank you, miss. I did not know him well in recent years." An awkward silence fell. Mrs. Henderson jumped into it with the subtlety of a buffalo stampede. "Grace is staying with us temporarily while she sorts out her travel arrangements. Such a terrible business with the stage accident. lost everything but what she was wearing, poor dear. But she has been such a help, cooking the most wonderful meals. I told Mr. Henderson just this morning that I have not eaten so well since my mother was alive. Benjamin shifted his weight, feeling trapped. Grace's expression remained neutral, but he caught a flicker of something in her eyes, embarrassment, perhaps, at being spoken about like livestock at auction. He cleared his throat. I came for supplies. Need flour, salt, coffee. The usual. Of course, of course. Mrs. Henderson began gathering items, talking the entire time. You know, Mr. Garrett, Grace is looking for temporary work while she saves money to continue her journey. She was heading to Seattle, you see, to take a position as a governess, but now she needs to replace her letters of recommendation and her wardrobe. These things take time. I told her she could stay with us as long as she likes, but we are so cramped in our quarters, and with winter coming, well, it would be Christian charity if someone with more space could offer her room and board in exchange for household help. The trap was sprung, and Benjamin stood in its jaws, acutely aware that both women were now looking at him. Grace's expression had shifted to something carefully blank, as if she was bracing herself for rejection or worse. Benjamin thought about the cabin, about propriety, about what the neighbors would say. Then he thought about his burned beans and the silence and the way Carlos had looked at him with something dangerously close to pity. I have a cabin, he heard himself say. 2 rooms. You could have the bedroom. I have been sleeping in the main room anyway, by the stove. It is not fancy, but it is warm and dry. Grace's eyes widened slightly. That is very generous, Mr. Garrett, but I would not want to impose or cause talk. Perhaps there is another family. Most families around here are packed tight as sardines for winter, Mrs. Henderson interrupted. The Garrett's place is one of the few with extra space, and Mr. Garrett is a respectable man, a hard worker. Why, Carlos stops by every day for the ranch work, so there would be others around. Nothing improper about it. Benjamin could see Grace wrestling with the decision, pride fighting with practicality. He recognized the look because he'd worn it himself plenty of times. I cannot pay wages, he said bluntly, but you would have room and board and privacy. I am not around much during the day. I could bring you to town once a week so you are not isolated. When you are ready to move on, no hard feelings. Something in his tone must have convinced her, that rough honesty that made it clear he wasn't looking for anything beyond the arrangement stated. Grace took a breath and nodded. I accept, Mr. Garrett. Thank you. I promise to earn my keep. I am a good cook and can manage a household well. They worked out the details quickly. Grace had almost nothing to bring, just a borrowed change of clothes and a small bag of toiletries the Hendersons had given her. She rode back to the ranch in Benjamin's wagon, seated as far from him as the bench allowed, both of them silent in the way of strangers uncertain how to begin. The Montana landscape rolled past, white and endless, beautiful in its harshness. Benjamin pointed out landmarks, the creek that ran through his property, the line of cottonwoods that marked the northern boundary, the distant peaks that looked close but were a day's ride away. At the ranch, he showed her the cabin with apologetic efficiency. It was small and rough, built by someone who valued function over form. The main room held a stove, a table with 2 chairs, shelves for supplies, and Benjamin's bedroll in the corner. The bedroom was barely large enough for the narrow bed and a chest of drawers, but it had a door that closed and a window with actual glass. Grace surveyed it all with an unreadable expression, then set down her small bag and rolled up her sleeves. I will start with supper, she said. What do you normally eat? Benjamin almost laughed. Beans, bacon when I have it, potatoes, biscuits that could be used as ammunition. The corner of Grace's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I think we can do better than that. May I see what supplies you have?" He showed her the pantry, which was really just a corner of the main room where he kept dry goods. There wasn't much. Flour, salt, a few cans of vegetables, dried beans, some withered potatoes, a slab of bacon going gray at the edges. Grace studied the meager selection with the focus of a general planning a campaign, then nodded to herself. "This will do for tonight. Tomorrow, if you are going into town, I will need a few additional items." "Nothing expensive," she added quickly, "but some herbs and perhaps some dried fruit would improve the variety." Benjamin agreed, and then did what he always did when faced with domestic situations. He fled to the barn to do evening chores. He fed the horses, checked on the cattle in the near pasture, repaired a piece of tack that didn't really need repairing. When he finally returned to the cabin, driven by darkness and cold, he stopped short on the threshold. The space had been transformed. Grace had cleaned while cooking, and the main room now had an order it had lacked before. The table was set with actual plates instead of his habit of eating from the pan. The stove glowed with warmth, and from a pot came a smell that made Benjamin's stomach clench with sudden, fierce hunger. Grace stood at the stove, stirring something, her profile outlined by lamplight. For a moment, Benjamin saw what the space could be, had been perhaps when Samuel and his wife were still alive. Not just shelter, but a home. Grace glanced over her shoulder. "I hope you do not mind that I rearranged a few things. I can put them back if you prefer." "No," Benjamin said, his voice rougher than intended. "It is fine. Good." She ladled stew into bowls, thick with potatoes and carrots and chunks of bacon that she'd somehow transformed into something that tasted like actual food rather than survival rations. There was cornbread too, golden and properly cooked, with butter melting into its steaming surface. Benjamin sat at his own table feeling like a guest, uncertain of the protocol. Grace sat across from him, her movements economical and graceful. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Benjamin tried to eat slowly, to show manners, but the food was so good after months of his own cooking that he had to force himself not to wolf it down like an animal. Grace picked at her own bowl, eating small amounts, and he realized she was nervous despite her capable exterior. "This is very good," he said finally. "Best meal I have had in a long time." Some tension left her shoulders. "Thank you. It is nothing fancy, but I believe even simple food should be prepared with care. Where did you learn to cook like this?" Grace hesitated, and Benjamin sensed he'd wandered into complicated territory. "My mother taught me. She believed a woman should know how to run a household properly. After she passed, I kept house for my father and brothers." Her tone was carefully neutral, giving facts without emotion. "You said you were headed to Seattle to be a governess." "Yes. I have experience teaching and references, or I did before they were destroyed. I will need to write to my previous employers and request new letters." She paused, her hands tight around her spoon. "My family is in Pennsylvania. After my father died last year, my brothers made it clear there was no place for me there. Their wives were not keen on having an unmarried sister underfoot. So I decided to head west, to start fresh." The story was familiar in outline if not detail. The West was full of people running from something or towards something, usually both. Benjamin recognized a kindred spirit in that regard. "I am sorry about your father." "Thank you, and again, I am sorry about your brother. Were you close?" "Not for many years. I left home young, ended up in Colorado mining silver. Samuel stayed in Missouri, married, moved out here to ranch. We wrote occasionally but did not visit. I did not even know he was sick until it was too late." The admission cost something, speaking aloud his failure. Grace met his eyes across the table, and he saw understanding there, not judgment. Sometimes distance happens. It does not mean you did not care. They finished the meal with sporadic conversation, feeling out the boundaries of this strange new arrangement. Benjamin helped clear the dishes, and Grace washed them in a basin of heated water, refusing his offer to help with a firmness that suggested she needed to establish her role. He retreated to his corner while she disappeared into the bedroom, the door closing with a soft click that somehow made the cabin feel both smaller and more alive than it had in months. Benjamin lay in his bedroll, staring at the ceiling beams and listening to small sounds from the other room, the creak of the bed, the rustle of fabric, a soft sigh. He thought about meals for two and how quickly a space could feel different with another person in it. He thought about Grace Porter's storm gray eyes and the set of her shoulders, carrying burdens she did not speak of. He thought about the way the cabin had smelled when he'd entered it, like food and warmth and something dangerously close to home. These were not thoughts he should be having about a woman who would leave in a few months, who was passing through his life as briefly as a season. Benjamin forced his mind to practical matters: fence repairs, winter feed, the bank note coming due. Eventually, he slept. The pattern established itself quickly. Benjamin rose before dawn, stoked the fire, and was out doing chores when Grace emerged from the bedroom. He'd returned for breakfast to find coffee brewing and actual food: eggs, bacon cooked properly, biscuits that didn't double as weapons. They'd eat together with minimal conversation, both still awkward in each other's presence. Then Benjamin would head out for the day's work. Grace, he discovered, was a whirlwind of productivity. The cabin had never been so clean. She organized his chaotic supplies, mended clothes he hadn't realized needed mending, and somehow made the rough space feel less like a survivalist camp and more like a home. Carlos noticed immediately. On Grace's third day at the ranch, he arrived for work and stood in the cabin doorway, openly staring at the transformation. Grace handed him a cup of coffee and a slice of bread with butter and jam, and Carlos looked at Benjamin with an expression of profound approval. "You did good, boss," he said in Spanish, which Grace presumably did not understand. "A man needs more than cattle." "It is temporary," Benjamin replied in the same language. "She is just staying until she can continue to Seattle." Carlos made a non-committal sound that suggested he knew better, then headed out to work. Benjamin followed, unsettled by the implications. The first week passed into the second. Snow fell heavily, isolating the ranch and making the weekly trip to town impossible. Benjamin worried that Grace would feel trapped, but she seemed content with the solitude, busy with projects that improved the cabin in small but meaningful ways. She asked permission to rearrange the kitchen area, and he agreed, surprised when she created a logical system that made cooking far more efficient. She found Samuel's wife's old curtains in a trunk and washed and hung them, softening the harsh light. She even attempted to make the bedroom more comfortable, though the furniture was sparse and she had almost nothing personal to make it her own. Meals became the highlight of Benjamin's day. Grace was a magician with limited ingredients, creating variety where he'd seen only monotony. Stews became different each time with clever use of herbs. She made bread pudding from stale ends, roasted root vegetables until they caramelized and sweet, stretched the bacon further than Benjamin thought possible. More than the food itself, it was the act of sitting down together, of having someone to share the meal with, that Benjamin had not realized he'd been starving for. Conversation came easier as familiarity grew. Grace asked about ranching, and Benjamin found himself explaining with more enthusiasm than he'd expected. The rhythm of the seasons, the personalities of individual cattle, the satisfaction of fixing something broken. She told him about teaching, about the children she'd worked with in Philadelphia, their curious minds and endless questions. She spoke about books she'd read, and Benjamin, embarrassed, admitted he'd never been much for reading beyond what was necessary. "That is a shame," Grace said. "Stories can take you anywhere, show you things you'd never see otherwise." "I suppose the West has been story enough for me," Benjamin replied, but he was curious despite himself. The next time the weather cleared enough for a trip to town, Grace asked if she could borrow books from the lending library. She returned with 3 volumes and began reading in the evenings by lamplight. Sometimes she'd read passages aloud while Benjamin worked on account books or mended tack, her voice giving life to words on a page. He found himself looking forward to these evenings, the quiet domesticity of it, the way Grace's voice could make even dusty books feel alive. December arrived with bitter cold and shorter days. Benjamin worried constantly about the cattle, about whether they had enough feed to last until spring, about the banknote that drew ever closer. He said nothing to Grace about his financial troubles, maintaining the fiction that everything was under control. But she was observant, and one evening while he sat at the table with the account books spread before him, frustration evident in every line of his body, she set down her book and simply asked, "How bad is it?" Benjamin considered lying, but something in her steady gaze made evasion feel insulting. "Bad enough. Samuel left debts. I have been trying to work through them, but this winter is hard and I am still learning the business. The bank wants $300 by spring and I am not sure I can make it." Grace was quiet for a moment, thinking, "What are your options?" "Sell cattle early, but I will take a loss since they are thin from winter. Take another loan, but that just digs the hole deeper. Or sell the ranch entirely, pay the debts, and walk away with whatever is left, which will not be much." "You do not want to sell." It was a statement, not a question, and its accuracy surprised him. "No," he admitted. "I did not think I would care about this place, but somewhere along the way it became mine. Samuel's dream, maybe, but I am living it now. Feels wrong to give up just because it is hard." "Then we will find another way," Grace said with quiet confidence, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to tie her fate to his problem. "We," Benjamin repeated. Grace flushed slightly but held his gaze. "I am living here too, benefiting from your generosity. And I have some experience with managing tight budgets. Between my father's illness and my brother's financial carelessness, I learned how to stretch a dollar until it screamed. Perhaps I can help." They worked through the numbers together, Grace proving to have a sharp mind for figures. She identified expenses that could be cut, suggested bartering with neighbors for services instead of paying cash, and proposed several small efficiency improvements that would save money over time. It was not a solution to the entire problem, but it was a start, and Benjamin felt something shift between them that night. They were no longer landlord and temporary tenant, but partners working toward a common goal. Christmas came during a blizzard that trapped them inside for 3 days straight. Benjamin had not planned to celebrate, had barely remembered the holiday, but Grace marked it with quiet determination. She made a special meal with hoarded ingredients. A small roasted chicken from a neighbor, potatoes mashed with real butter and cream, dried apple pie that tasted like summer. She even produced 2 small gifts, handkerchiefs she'd embroidered using thread from the general store and spare cloth. Benjamin's had his initials in the corner, the stitching precise and even. He had nothing for her, had not thought to prepare anything, and felt like a fool. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not realize you what I should have." "It is all right," Grace interrupted gently. "I did not expect anything. I just wanted to mark the day. It is my first Christmas away from family, strange as that family was. I needed it to feel like something. Benjamin understood that, the need to create meaning in emptiness. On impulse, he went to the trunk where he'd stored Samuel's belongings and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a silver brooch shaped like a bird, simple but beautifully crafted. It had belonged to Samuel's wife, and Benjamin had not known what to do with it. "This was my sister-in-law's," he said, holding it out to Grace. "I think she would have liked you to have it. You have done more to honor this place than I could have alone." Grace took the brooch with trembling fingers, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will treasure it." That night, sitting by the stove with snow howling outside, they talked longer and deeper than ever before. Grace told him about her mother's death when she was 15, how she'd stepped into the role of woman of the house and lost her own youth in the process. She spoke about her father's slow decline, the way he'd become someone else in his final years, angry and bitter. She admitted that coming west felt like escape and cowardice in equal measure. Benjamin shared things he'd never told anyone. How he'd left home because his father had been a drunk who took his failures out on his sons. How he'd spent years drifting and searching for something he could not name. How Samuel's death had forced him to stop running and finally stand still long enough to build something. They were two people who'd been alone too long, learning the difficult art of letting someone see the broken places. "You regret coming here?" Benjamin asked. "If the stage had not crashed, you would be in Seattle by now, starting your new life." Grace considered this seriously as she did everything. 2 months ago I would have said yes, this was not my plan. But now, she met his eyes, something vulnerable and brave in her expression. "No, I do not regret it. This has been hard in different ways, but also good. I feel useful here." Needed. I had forgotten what that felt like. Benjamin wanted to tell her she was more than useful, that she'd brought life back into a dead man's house, that he'd started looking forward to evening meals and morning coffee, and all the small moments that made up a shared life. But the words felt too big, too presumptuous. She was leaving in the spring. He needed to remember that. January arrived with brutal cold that killed 2 head of cattle despite Benjamin's best efforts. He found them frozen in the north pasture and spent the rest of the day in a black mood, feeling the weight of failure. Grace said nothing when he came in that night, just put food in front of him and sat quietly while he picked at it. Later, while he sat staring at the fire, she came and sat beside him, not touching but close enough that he could feel her warmth. "You cannot save them all," she said softly. "You did everything you could. It was not enough. Sometimes it is not. That does not make you a failure. It makes you human." Benjamin turned to look at her, this woman who'd arrived in his life by accident and somehow become essential. In the firelight, her face was lovely, all soft shadows and gentle strength. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him. A rough rancher with calloused hands and uncertain prospects, a man who'd been alone so long he'd forgotten how to be otherwise. "Grace," he began, not knowing how to finish. She waited, patient and still, her gray eyes holding his. "I am glad you are here," he finally said. "However it happened, whatever comes next, I am glad for this time." Something shifted in her expression, a wall coming down. "So am I," she whispered. They sat together until the fire burned low, not speaking, just being. It was the closest Benjamin had felt to another person in more years than he could count, and it terrified him as much as it comforted him. February brought a thaw that turned everything to mud, but also meant the worst of winter was passing. Benjamin began planning for spring, which fields to use for grazing, repairs needed on fences and buildings, when to bring cattle to market. The bank note loomed large in his mind, an impossible deadline that he tried not to think about too much. Grace continued to manage the household with quiet efficiency, and neighbors who stopped by began commenting on how well Benjamin looked, how the ranch seemed more prosperous somehow. "That lady you took in is working out well," old Tom from the neighboring ranch observed one day. "My wife says she has not seen you look so settled since you arrived." "She is just staying temporarily," Benjamin said, defensive, "until she saves enough to continue to Seattle." Tom gave him a long look. "If you say so, son. But from where I stand, you would be a fool to let that one get away. Good women who can handle this life are rare as hen's teeth." The comment bothered Benjamin more than it should have. He'd been thinking the same thing for weeks now, but had not allowed himself to truly acknowledge it. Grace was supposed to leave. That was the arrangement. He had no right to ask her to stay, to tie herself to a struggling ranch, and a man who barely knew how to talk to her beyond practical matters. But the thought of the cabin without her, of going back to meals for one in that crushing silence, felt unbearable. He started noticing small things. The way Grace smiled when she saw the first robin of spring, how she hummed while cooking, the careful way she mended his clothes as if each stitch mattered. He noticed that she'd stopped talking about Seattle, that when neighbors asked about her plans, her answers grew vague. He noticed that she watched him sometimes when she thought he was not looking, her expression unguarded and impossibly soft. One evening in late February, while they were cleaning up after supper, their hands brushed reaching for the same dish. It was an accident, meaningless contact, but Benjamin felt it like a spark. Grace froze, and when he looked at her, he saw his own awareness reflected back. They stood there, inches apart, the dish forgotten between them. "Grace," he said, her name a question and a prayer. "Yes." Her voice was barely audible. "I need to tell you something, but I do not want to presume or make you uncomfortable. If you want me to stop, just say so." She nodded, waiting, her breath coming faster. "I know you are supposed to leave come spring. That was our arrangement, and I will honor it if that is what you want. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about an arrangement for me. I look forward to seeing you in the morning. I think about you during the day while I am working. At night, I lie awake knowing you are just in the other room and wishing." He stopped, took a breath, forced himself to continue. "I am not good at this, at talking about feelings. I have been alone too long. But you have made this place feel like a home, and I do not want to go back to how it was before. I do not want you to go." Grace's eyes had filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I do not want to go either," she whispered. "I have been terrified you would make arrangements to send me to Seattle because you were tired of having me here. Benjamin, I stopped thinking about this as temporary weeks ago. When I imagine the future now, I am here with you, working beside you, if you will have me." Relief and joy flooded through him, so intense it was almost painful. "If I will have you, Grace, you are the best thing that has happened to me in longer than I can remember. I am asking you to stay not as hired help but as my wife, if you will consider it. I know I do not have much to offer. The ranch is struggling, and I am not educated or refined, but I swear I will work every day to make you happy and give you the life you deserve." Grace laughed, a sound of pure happiness, and reached up to touch his face with gentle fingers. "You are offering me everything I want. A home, a partner, a purpose. Yes, Benjamin. Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her then, tentative at first and then with growing confidence as she responded in kind. It was his first kiss in years, and it felt like coming home after a long journey through the wilderness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Grace rested her forehead against his. "I was so lonely before I came here," she said quietly. "I had given up on the idea that someone might want me, not just my labor or my usefulness, but me. You see me, Benjamin. You listen when I talk. You have made me feel valued in a way I never did with my own family. You were always valuable, he said fiercely. They were fools not to recognize it. I almost made the same mistake, almost let you leave because I was too scared to ask you to stay. I will not make that error again. You are mine now, and I am yours, and we will build this life together. They made plans late into the night, sitting close on the bench by the stove, hands intertwined. They would marry as soon as the preacher could ride out from Billings, a simple ceremony with Carlos and the Hendersons as witnesses. Grace would write to Seattle and decline the governess position. They would face the ranch's financial troubles together, combining their strengths to find solutions. They talked about children, about expanding the house, about all the ordinary dreams that felt extraordinary when shared. The wedding took place on a bright March morning, the prairie still patched with snow but showing hints of green. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her make, with the silver bird brooch pinned at her collar. Benjamin wore his cleanest clothes and boots he'd polished until they shone. The ceremony was short and sincere, their vows spoken with full hearts before God and their small community of friends. That night, in the bedroom that was now truly theirs, Benjamin held his wife and marveled at the turns life took. A year ago, he'd been alone in a Colorado mine shaft with no prospects and no future. Now he had a ranch, a wife, and something that felt dangerously like happiness. Grace traced patterns on his chest with her fingertips, her head resting over his heart. "Tell me what you are thinking," she said. "That I am the luckiest man alive. That I do not deserve you, but I will spend my life trying to." "We deserve each other," Grace corrected gently. "We both made our way through hard times to get here. This is not luck, Benjamin. This is us choosing to build something together." Spring arrived in full, bringing new life to the prairie and new challenges to the ranch. The bank note came due in April, and Benjamin faced it with Grace at his side. They had scraped together $200 through careful savings and the sale of some cattle, but they were still $100 short. Benjamin prepared himself to lose the ranch, to watch everything Samuel had built slip away. But Grace had been busy. She had been in correspondence with several families in Billings, offering cooking services for special events. The beef roast that had drawn so much attention months earlier became the beginning of a small business. Grace cooked for weddings and celebrations, creating meals that had people talking and requesting her services. The money was not huge, but combined with what they had saved, it was enough. When they walked into the bank to make the payment, Benjamin carried the full $300. The banker counted it twice, clearly surprised, and marked the loan as satisfied. Outside, Benjamin pulled Grace into an embrace, not caring who saw. "You saved us," he said. "We saved us," she corrected. "You kept the ranch running through a brutal winter. I just helped with the finances. We are partners, remember?" They walked through Billings hand in hand, stopping to pick up supplies and share their success with the Hendersons. Mrs. Henderson was delighted, claiming she'd known from the start they were meant for each other. Carlos, when they told him the news back at the ranch, simply nodded as if it confirmed what he'd always believed. Summer brought hard work and slow prosperity. The cattle that had survived winter fattened on spring grass. Benjamin's skills as a rancher improved with Grace's partnership, her organizational mind complementing his physical labor. They worked together on everything, making decisions jointly, each respecting the other's strengths. The ranch began to feel less like Samuel's legacy and more like their shared creation. In August, Grace told Benjamin she was pregnant. He received the news with a mixture of joy and terror, suddenly aware of how much he had to lose. But Grace was calm and confident, already planning for the changes a child would bring. They began adding onto the cabin, building a small nursery room. Neighbors helped with the construction, and the community that Benjamin had kept at arm's length during his first isolated months now surrounded him with support and friendship. Grace continued cooking for special events in town until she grew too large to easily make the journey. Her reputation had spread, and people spoke of the Garrett Ranch as a place of warmth and good food, no longer the lonely outpost it had been. Benjamin found himself hosting neighbors for dinner, something he would never have imagined a year earlier, with Grace presiding over the table with natural grace. Their son was born in March of 1884, during a late snowstorm that trapped them in the cabin with only Carlos for help. Grace labored through the night with fierce determination, and when Benjamin held his son for the first time, he wept without shame. They named him Samuel Benjamin Garrett, honoring the brother who had inadvertently brought them together and the future they were building. Fatherhood changed Benjamin in ways he had not anticipated. The rough edges softened, the silence that had defined him for so long gave way to laughter and conversation. He talked to his son constantly while doing chores, carrying the baby in a sling Grace had made, pointing out birds and cattle and all the wonders of their prairie home. Grace watched them together with such love it made Benjamin's chest ache. "I never imagined this," she told him one evening while they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Samuel slept in her arms, tiny and perfect. "When I left Pennsylvania, I thought I was heading toward loneliness, toward being useful but never truly wanted. Instead, I found everything I needed right here." Benjamin pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "You gave me everything I needed too. I had been cooking for one for so long, eating alone, living alone, thinking that was just how life would be. Then you arrived and made dinner for two without even being asked, like you knew what I needed before I did. You saved me, Grace. Not just the ranch, but me." "We saved each other," Grace said, repeating the refrain that had become their truth. The years that followed were not without challenges. Ranching in Montana was never easy, and they faced droughts and hard winters, market fluctuations and equipment failures. But they faced everything together, their partnership deepening with each obstacle overcome. The cabin expanded gradually, becoming a real house with multiple bedrooms and a proper kitchen where Grace worked her culinary magic. More children followed. A daughter in 1886 named Ruth after Grace's mother, another son in 1888 named William, and finally another daughter in 1890 named Clara. The house filled with noise and life, with children's laughter and the controlled chaos of a growing family. Benjamin, who had once lived in crushing silence, now could not imagine a quiet house and did not want to. Carlos became an integral part of their family, eventually bringing his own children to work on the ranch during busy seasons. The Garrett Ranch grew steadily more prosperous as Benjamin's skills improved, and Grace's financial acumen kept them on solid ground. They never became wealthy, but they built security and stability, owning the land free and clear by 1890. Grace never did make it to Seattle, never became a governess to strangers' children. Instead, she built a home and raised her own family, taught her own children, and created a life richer than any position could have offered. She continued cooking for special events in Billings when time allowed, becoming something of a local legend. People spoke of Grace Garrett's cooking the way they spoke of natural wonders, with awe and appreciation. Benjamin became a respected member of the ranching community, known for his fair dealing and hard work. But more than that, he became a man who understood the value of partnership, who never took his wife for granted, who made a point of saying thank you for every meal she prepared as if it were the first. The loneliness that had defined his early years became a distant memory. replaced by the beautiful chaos of a life fully lived. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1893, Benjamin and Grace sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Samuel, at 9, was teaching 7-year-old Ruth how to rope fence posts. William, 5, was attempting to catch chickens with more enthusiasm than skill. 2-year-old Clara toddled around under everyone's feet, laughing at everything. "You remember that first dinner?" Benjamin asked. "When you arrived at the ranch and made stew from practically nothing," Grace smiled. "I remember thinking you looked half-starved and completely lost. I remember wondering what I had gotten myself into, moving to a strange man's ranch in the middle of nowhere. I remember being terrified and trying not to show it." "I was terrified too," Benjamin admitted. "I had been alone so long I did not know how to be around people anymore, but you made it easy somehow. You just stepped in and started making dinner for 2 like it was the most natural thing in the world." "It was natural," Grace said softly. "From the first evening, cooking for you felt right. It felt like this was where I was supposed to be, even though logic said I should be afraid or uncertain. My heart knew before my head did." Benjamin reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "I love you," he said, words that still came hard but came more easily now than they had at first. "I love our life, our children, everything we have built together. Thank you for staying, for choosing this, for choosing me." "I love you too," Grace replied, squeezing his hand. "And I would choose you again every single time. This life, this family, this home, it is everything I ever wanted and more than I dared dream of. You gave me a place to belong, Benjamin. You gave me a home." They sat together as the sun set over their land, over the home they had built and the children they were raising, over a life that had started with a stagecoach accident and a man who had been cooking for one too long. Grace had arrived when Benjamin needed her most, had made dinner for 2 without being asked, and in that simple act had changed everything. What started as a practical arrangement born of necessity had transformed into a love story as vast and enduring as the Montana prairie itself. The children's laughter carried on the evening air, mixing with the lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through grass. Inside the house, the table was already set for dinner, plates arranged for 7 instead of 1, a testament to how full their lives had become. Benjamin stood and helped Grace to her feet, and together they walked toward their home, toward the family waiting inside, toward the meal they would share together as they had shared countless meals before, and would share countless more in the years to come. This was the life Benjamin Garrett had never known he wanted until Grace Porter arrived and showed him what he had been missing. No longer was he a man cooking for one, eating in silence, existing but not truly living. Now he was a husband, a father, a rancher building a legacy, a man who understood that the greatest wealth was not measured in dollars or acres but in shared meals and shared lives, in love given and received, in the simple, profound joy of never having to be alone again. And Grace, who had left Pennsylvania thinking she was running away from rejection and toward an uncertain future, had instead run straight into the arms of destiny. She had found in this rough Montana ranch and this silent hurting man the home and love she had always deserved but never received. Together, they proved that sometimes the best things in life arrive unexpected and unplanned, in the form of a stagecoach accident and a dinner made for 2.